troops and coalition force and who are planning or are carrying out an attack against our country or our coalition partners. It does not apply to everyone who might be termed a terrorist, and it does not apply to United States citizens who are members of al-Qaeda.
Ask my friend further, has the United States Congress authorized the use of military force against al-Qaeda and associated forces?
I would answer yes, it has. So my amendment only pertains to enemy combatants against whom Congress has declared we are in an armed conflict with. And because we are in an armed conflict with al-Qaeda and associated forces, the Congress has authorized the use of military force to combat them, and that is why it's called the Authorization for the Use of Military Force.
Now, I can't recall a time when Congress has declared that we're in an armed conflict, has authorized the use of military force against the enemy in that conflict, and yet the executive branch has a bias against using the military for interrogation and, if need be, the trial of enemy forces. Can the senator from New Hampshire recall such an occasion?
No, I cannot.
2 days ago, the President's top lawyer at the Pentagon defended the administration's use of lethal force against an American citizen who is a member of al-Qaeda. In doing so, he noted that using lethal force in such a case is perfectly appropriate because that person was an enemy combatant. Specifically, he said, those who are part of the congressionally declared enemy do not have immunity if they are U.S. citizens. So, does it not strike my friend from New Hampshire as inconsistent for the administration to authorize lethal force against a member of al-Qaeda, even if he's a U.S. citizen, because he is part of an enemy force as declared by the Congress, but on the other hand, not to trust the military to try by military commission members of the same enemy force who are foreign nationals?
It certainly strikes me as very inconsistent. It's especially odd given that the military commissions were enacted by Congress at the suggestion of our United States Supreme Court. They were passed on a bipartisan basis and were refined by the Obama administration to its liking. Yet the administration refuses to fully use them and as they were intended.
So the senator from New Hampshire's amendment to this appropriation bill makes clear that in the war on terror we remain at war with al-Qaeda and associated groups, that these forces remain intent on killing Americans, and that in prosecuting this war, a higher priority should be placed on capturing enemy combatants, interrogating them for additional intelligence value, and thereby targeting other terrorists. That is the purpose, as I understand it, of the amendment of the senator from New Hampshire. In military custody, our national security professionals would have the choice of prosecuting enemy combatants in a military commission, detaining them under the law of war, and periodically questioning them for intelligence as new information is developed without them being all lawyered up.
Yes, and yesterday some of our colleagues came to the floor to argue that my amendment would limit the choices available to our commander-in-chief in prosecuting terrorists. I would ask the Republican leader the following. In January of 2009, did President Obama, when he first came into office, issue executive orders ending the Central Intelligence Agency's detention program, ending the CIA's option for using enhanced interrogation techniques, ordering the closure of the secure detention facility at Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, prior to any study being done concerning how to dispose of the population of enemy combatants there? We now know that 27% of them are back in theater, and suspending military commissions.
Well, of course, the senator from New Hampshire is entirely correct. President Obama has unilaterally restricted the tools available to him for combating terrorism, including by ordering the closing of Guantanamo Bay prior to having any plan for dealing with the population of Yemeni detainees that are almost certain to return to the fight if they are released from Guantanamo Bay. It seems that once the President shut down the ability of the CIA to detain enemy combatants and refused to transfer any further detainees to Guantanamo Bay, that many of us were waiting for the obvious test case to come along in which a terrorist was captured outside of Iraq or Afghanistan and needed to be interrogated and detained. Now, I know the senator from New Hampshire is a member of the Armed Services Committee. Does she recall the case of Mr. Warsame, the Somali terrorist captured at sea?
I do, and the Republican leader is correct that this test case shows that in capturing rather than killing terrorists, we can gain valuable intelligence. Instead of sending Warsame to Guantanamo, though, he was held and interrogated at sea for approximately 2 months. Then law enforcement officials were brought in to read Warsame his rights. And I want to take the minute to address arguments that were made on the floor earlier by Senator Levin from Michigan, the chairman of the Armed Services Committee. He claimed that if my amendment were to pass, that Mr. Warsame would escape justice because we wouldn't be able to prove that he was in fact planning an attack against the United States. Well, I want to point out that if that were the case, my amendment would not apply, because my amendment applies to members of al-Qaeda or affiliated groups who are also planning or have carried out an attack against the United States. So he would be able to be fully held accountable in the civilian court system. And I wanted to correct that because I think that leaves a misimpression that Mr. Warsame will not be or could not be held accountable under our law. But I'd also like to say that the second problem with the analysis of the senator from Michigan is that it ignores what's really going on here. The reason that the United States had to take the unusual steps of holding Warsame at sea on a Navy ship and then flying him to the United States over the 4th of July weekend is because of the administration's refusal to use the top-rate detention facility at Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, that we have there for long-term military detention. Because it refuses to use this valuable asset for new captures, the administration has gone to great lengths to treat these enemy combatants who are captured on an ad hoc basis, instead of placing them in a long-term detention facility, which places an artificial time period on when we can interrogate these individuals and how long they will be available to gather information to protect Americans. As the Republican leader has noted, the President's top lawyer at the Pentagon observed that members of al-Qaeda are enemy combatants and that Congress has passed an authorization for the use of military force to treat them as such. We need to do that on a consistent basis and use the military assets we have. We should not have an ad hoc, haphazard approach to treating enemy combatants. We should not Mirandize enemy combatants who are our military captors and then hold them on makeshift prison barges as if we were in the 19th century because the administration refuses to use Guantanamo Bay and then import them into the United States so they can be detained in our civilian court system, tried in our civilian courts, with the possibility that they could be released to the United States if they're acquitted or given a modest sentence, as nearly happened with Ahmed Gilani. Now is the time to keep the pressure on al-Qaeda. Whether in the tribal areas of Pakistan or in Yemen, our law enforcement officials have done a tremendous job in contributing to the counterterrorism fight. But we cannot, for the first time in the history of this country, take the view of the Attorney General, which is that our civilian court system is the most effective weapon in our conflict with al-Qaeda, because that's simply not the case. Thank you, Mr. President.
Mr. President, I want to thank the senator from New Hampshire on behalf of the leader. She has brought to the floor an outstanding amendment that needs to be addressed, because this is an issue that is certainly one on a lot of people's minds. Why would we be using our judicial system for enemy combatants? And she has articulated it so well as the former Attorney General of New Hampshire, and we appreciate so much that she's brought this amendment and is going to get a lot of support from the American people as well as members of the Senate. Thank you, Mr. President.
Mr. President,
The majority leader is recognized.
we have worked very hard to move through this first tranche of appropriation bills that we have. Progress is being made, but not nearly enough progress. I'm going to move in just a minute to the Bryson nomination, but I want everyone within the sound of my voice to understand this cannot go on forever. People sometimes are unreasonable. We cannot have votes on all these amendments that have been called up here. I would hope that everyone would understand that there has to be some give and take here, and we need to move through this. They need to be cooperative with their staffs, because when this matter is finished regarding the Secretary of Commerce nomination, we're going to have to make a decision as to whether we continue working on this appropriation bill. This is a noble experiment. I'm part of it. I want it to work very, very much. But it can't work without the cooperation of all senators. And I say to everyone listening here, this is the way it's always been. I was a member of the Appropriations Committee the first day I came to the Senate, and I managed many appropriation bills here on the Senate floor. In every one of them, we had more amendments than we had time to vote on them. That's where we are today. But the only way we can finish them is work through these amendments. We hope we can do that. Otherwise, we'll have a cloture vote either tonight or tomorrow and determine whether or not we want to finish these appropriation bills. All really extremely important. Commerce, State Justice, Agriculture, and of course the transportation bill. It would be really good for us to be able to get this done. I heard Susan Collins, Senator from Maine, speak about this a little earlier today, and she did an extremely good job of explaining why it's important that we do this. Under the previous order, Mr. President, I move to executive session, call up calendar number 410, the nomination of John Bryson to be Commerce Secretary.
The clerk will report.
Nomination, Department of Commerce, John Edgar Bryson of California to be Secretary of Commerce.
Mr. President.
The majority leader.
Mr. President, there's 4 hours under the order previously entered. We would hope that all this time will not have to be used. I ask that that 20 minutes remain equally divided between the two leaders or the designees, regardless of any time consumed in quorum calls or other presentations made on this matter.
Is there objection? Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. President, I would like to congratulate my friend, the chairman of the committee, the Commerce Committee, and the senator from Texas, Kay Bailey Hutchison. They both worked very, very hard in a fair way to move forward on this. It's been good for the Senate. When we confirm this nomination, it'll be good for the country. I don't think we'll use all this time. I hope we can vote on this matter anywhere between 6:30 and 7:30 tonight. Hope closer to 6:30.
President.
Senior Senator from West Virginia.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent the order of the quorum call be rescinded.
Senator is recognized for...
Mr. President, I rise in strong support of John Bryson of California, who President Obama has nominated to be his Secretary of Commerce. Mr. Bryson's nomination comes at a very critical time for our country and for our economy. No one disputes that Secretary of Commerce is an important part of the President's economic team. That person is now missing in the Commerce Department. Commerce has to do with jobs. Nobody there. That dictates that we have a leader with strong, real-world experience in the post. This position has been vacant since Ambassador Locke left for China in late July. Stunning to think that with what the country is going through, we don't have a cabinet secretary who can attend to manufacturing and other kinds of jobs and job-related efforts that he will do. But because of the assistance of the minority, and I have no objection to this, we were unable to move this nomination until the trade agreement was finished. The trade agreements had to come forward, they had to be passed. That was done, and then it was okay to proceed to the Bryson nomination. The Commerce, Science, and Transportation Committee confirmed Mr. Bryson by a voice vote. I recall no objections at all. Mr. Bryson will be an excellent Secretary of Commerce, and America is entitled to have a Secretary of Commerce on the job. Mr. Bryson possesses a rare combination of actual real-life business experience and a very broad intellect. As an executive, he has proven himself to be a talented executive and has shown his dedication to public service. He cares about public service. He's had to wait a long time to get this job, and he's been in and out of public service. My colleagues should appreciate that Mr. Bryson's confirmation comes at an important crossroads for the country and for the Commerce Department itself. The challenges obviously are very important. High employment, a slow economic recovery. The Secretary of Commerce plays a major role in promoting jobs and our economy. But to do that, he has to be in place on the job. If confirmed, as I believe he deserves to be, he will have to face these steep challenges and looks forward to so doing. But I believe Mr. Bryson's experience provides him with the capacity to help restore jobs and manufacturing in America as the Secretary of Commerce. I've long fought for a stronger manufacturing sector in this country. Anybody from West Virginia would be crazy to do otherwise. Manufacturing has been hit hard all over the country in this past decade, losing nearly one-third of its workforce, and the government's response has been, I think, piecemeal. This needs to change. If the next decade is as bad for manufacturing jobs as the previous one, we're going to have very little left to work with of a manufacturing sector if we're trying to save it. This has grave national security implications, could cripple our ability to out-innovate and out-compete other countries. That's already happening. In the Commerce Committee, we held 3 hearings on this issue this year, that is manufacturing, and we also included a field hearing, happened to be in West Virginia, total coincidence, on exporting products made in America. Mr. Bryson knows that if confirmed, I intend to work with him to make manufacturing a high priority in our job-creating agenda. A word on NOAA and NIST. Mr. Bryson will also bring his leadership to help NOAA innovate its essential services that help all Americans, from daily weather forecasts to fisheries management, from coastal restoration to supporting marine commerce, and on and on and on. NOAA's products and services support economic vitality and affect more than one-third of America's gross domestic product. Americans in many states across the nation have suffered record-breaking weather disasters in 2011, and much of the Gulf continues to recover from the worst oil spill in our history. Mr. Bryson's business-minded leadership is valuable now more than ever to help NOAA continue to improve its important services and keep pace with scientific innovation. The Department of Commerce also houses the National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST, an extraordinary place. I think we have a couple of Nobel laureates out of NIST in the last year. NIST is critical to U.S. innovation and economic competitiveness through its measurement of science, standards, and technological development. NIST plays a critical role bringing together industry, government, and universities to advance everything from manufacturing to cybersecurity to forensic science standards. Mr. Bryson's own experience in both the public and the private sector will serve him well as he and his department tackle such national challenges. In closing, Mr. President, Mr. Bryson is eminently qualified to be Secretary of Commerce and to lead this important cabinet department during a time in which the American people are looking for innovative solutions to improve our economy and create jobs. And we need all the good people we can get. I urge my colleagues to quickly support Mr. Bryson's confirmation so he can begin his important work towards that end. I would yield to my distinguished friend from the state of Massachusetts, Senator Kerry.
Mr. President. The senator from Massachusetts is recognized.
I thank the chair, and I want to thank the chairman of the Commerce Committee, the senator from West Virginia. Mr. President, I strongly support the nomination of John Bryson to serve as Secretary of Commerce. I think he is an exceptional choice by the President, and I am absolutely confident, having served with many Commerce Secretaries through the years, that he's going to be one of our best. I think he's the right person at this moment in time to be taking the helm at the Department of Commerce. It is a critical, defining moment in many ways for our economy. The challenges are well known by everybody here in the Senate. And the decisions that we make or fail to make on new energy sources, on infrastructure, technology, research, all of the items that the senator from West Virginia just mentioned, all of those are going to play a critical part in defining the United States leadership role in the global economy. The experience of John Bryson in the private sector has won him broad support in the business community. And I would ask unanimous consent that a letter from the former Secretaries of Commerce serving both Republican and Democrat administrations alike be placed in the record as if read in full.
Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. President, I would just say to you that this is a letter written to Senator Reid and Senator McConnell from Carlos Gutierrez, former Commerce Secretary, Norm Mineta, Barbara Franklin, Don Evans, Mickey Cantor, Pete Peterson, all of whom are strongly supportive of this nomination. In addition, I would ask unanimous consent that a letter to Senator Reid from the President and CEO of the Hispanic business community, that they also be placed in the record as if read in full.
Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. President, let me just say very quickly that John Bryson brings to this role the special qualities of somebody who has served as a chairman and CEO of one of the nation's largest utility companies for almost 20 years, CEO of Edison International. He's been a board member for nonprofit organizations as well as for major corporations in our country, Boeing, Disney, some of the great success stories of our country. He has extensive experience working on international issues through his work at Edison International and as chair of the Pacific Council on International Policy. And I am convinced that if he's confirmed as Secretary of Commerce today, he's going to focus on increasing American exports, and he will be a superb ambassador, helping American companies who are looking to expand across the globe. This is a person who has already proven his ability to be able to deal with people in other countries, with other companies, and I'm confident about his ability to perform this task. His previous experience has exposed him to the importance of innovation and technology at a vital time for the information economy. And his department is now leading the administration in its efforts on issues ranging from privacy to spectrum reform. I am confident he is the right person to help make that process work. I also know that his work on competitiveness means that he will be at the forefront of helping to lead our country to, in fact, take the skills of our workers, the infrastructure of the nation, and retain and bring the brightest people in the world to this task. Finally, I just want to close saying that in my conversations with, I hope, Secretary-to-be Bryson, he we raised an issue that is of critical importance to us in Massachusetts. Because of federal regulations limiting fishing in our waters, a lot of our fishermen have been put out of business or pushed to the brink, and there's a great frustration that exists between the fishing community in our region and the federal government. When I met with John Bryson, he exhibited an understanding of the importance of that issue and a willingness to come to Massachusetts and help us resolve this current situation. We are, frankly, here waiting for his confirmation months after those conversations took place and his talents could have been put to use in so much of the challenge that we face in this nation. So I hope my colleagues will join together in an overwhelming vote of support for this outstanding, capable nominee who I think is the right person for this time.
President?
Senator for West Virginia.
From
Can't hear you.
California.
Oh, thank you very much, Chairman Rockefeller and Mr. President.
When he's recognized.
I believe John Bryson is really well suited for this role, particularly at a time when our economy is fragile and job creation isn't occurring fast enough. He has a lot of experience. Senator Kerry just pointed this out. He has run a multi-billion-dollar company. He has been a strong advocate for business. He is ready to advance a jobs agenda, and all of that makes him a perfect fit for Commerce Secretary. I first got to know John when he served for 18 years as CEO of Edison International, one of the 200 largest corporations in the United States, with more than 20,000 employees. Edison International is the parent company of Southern California Edison, which provides power to 14 million Californians and nearly 300,000 businesses. As my colleagues may recall, in 2000 and 2001, California was gripped by an energy crisis that resulted in rolling blackouts that left millions of Californians in the dark. The period marked the most turbulent era ever for the California power sector. Price caps, manipulation, rolling blackouts, deregulation, and Enron became the focus of our attention. During that difficult time, John's company was under siege. I watched closely as he successfully fended off financial disaster, even as other California utilities were swept into bankruptcy. I met and spoke with John often during that energy crisis and remember well his intelligence and pragmatism as utilities, state officials, and Washington worked our way through the crisis. Some say that a crisis serves as the best test of a person's character. If that's so, John Bryson is a man of exceptional character. In my observation, he worked hard to hear from the people of California, his shareholders, and the many businesses that relied on a stable power grid. And after emerging from the crisis, from 2003 to 2007, John turned Edison around completely. The firm was #1 among investor-owned utility companies for returning value to its shareholders. I believe he will carry this same thoughtful, sensible leadership style with him to the Commerce Department. In addition to his time at Edison, he served as director, chairman, or advisor for a wide array of companies, schools, and nonprofit organizations, including many institutions with deep roots in my home state, California, such as the Walt Disney Company, Bright Source Energy, Boeing, and the asset manager, KKR, the California Business Roundtable, the Public Policy Institute of California, and the University of Southern California's Keck School of Medicine, the Council on Foreign Relations, Stanford University, the California Institute of Technology, and the California Endowment. I'm also proud to note
that John and I share the same alma mater, Stanford, where John earned his undergraduate degree. Later, he attended Yale Law School before returning to California. So, John Bryson's experience paints a picture of a leader who focuses on the practical and the achievable. I believe, if confirmed, he will support measures that meet those criteria. At this time in our economic history, our #1 priority as a government must be to grow the economy and get people back to work. I know my Senate colleagues agree, and in my view, John Bryson's combination of pragmatism, experience in the boardroom, and understanding of the public sector will make him an outstanding Commerce Secretary. I expect he will be a powerful voice inside the administration and a partner with the business community to grow our economy and open international markets for American manufacturers. I make these remarks on behalf of my colleague, Senator Boxer, as well. We have a California candidate for Secretary of Commerce. We're the largest state in the union. We've got 12.1%. We need job generation. And so I trust that John Bryson is going to provide this and provide it as expeditiously as is humanly possible. I thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
The senator from Wyoming is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I listened to the statements made by my colleagues, and I have come to a different conclusion. I think that this nominee is actually the wrong person at the worst time, at a time when unemployment rate is 9.1%, when 14 million Americans are looking for work. I would think that the President would want to respond appropriately and nominate someone to lead the Commerce Department whose record was consistent with the mission outlined for the Commerce Department. And that mission is to promote job creation, to promote economic growth, to promote sustainable development and improve standards of living for all Americans. So I would think that the President would want to nominate someone who has a record of robust job creation. Instead, the President has nominated someone whose political advocacy is, in my opinion, detached from the financial hardships facing tens of millions of Americans today. Most Americans recognize that cap and trade, or as I call it, cap and tax, is job killing. It is a job-killing energy tax. Yet this nominee has repeatedly advocated for cap and trade legislation. He had even called the Waxman-Markey legislation a moderate but acceptable bill. There are colleagues on the other side of the aisle that support that legislation. I do not. I view it as a tax. The nominee even went so far as to say that the legislation was good precisely because it was a good way to hide, Mr. President, to hide a carbon tax. But is that the role of the Secretary of Commerce, to hide taxes on American businesses, on American families, to make American businesses less competitive, to make it more expensive for them to hire new workers? I want to find ways to make it easier and cheaper for the private sector to create jobs, not for ways to hide taxes and make it more expensive and harder for the private sector to create jobs. And finally, Mr. Chairman, Mr. President, I would like to point out what happened during the confirmation hearing before the Senate Commerce Committee. The chairman of the committee, who is here on the floor, questioned Mr. Bryson about coal. Coal is important to the chairman's state. It's very important in my state, a big part of our economy. And he asked for straight, direct answers, which the chairman did not receive, to the point that he actually invited the nominee to visit with him privately in his office to discuss the issues. So, Mr. President, I come here today to say we need a Commerce Secretary who is committed to making American businesses more innovative at home and more competitive abroad. More innovative at home, more competitive abroad. We need someone who will address the problems of high unemployment,
slow economic growth, and rising consumer costs aggressively and dispassionately. So, Mr. President, in my opinion, John Bryson is not that person, and therefore I will not support nor will I vote for his nomination. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Texas is recognized.
Mr. President, today, very shortly, we will vote on President Obama's nominee to be the Secretary of Commerce. This is a most senior position in the department, and with unemployment at 9.1% and most certainly trying to promote business, to create jobs, we need a Secretary of Commerce. The administration has talked about job creation and the need for regulatory reform, but to be honest, I haven't seen regulatory reform get a priority on the President's agenda. You might not find a price tag for regulation, but there's no question that businesses know when they are over-regulated, it stifles their ability to create jobs. This year alone, regulations are projected to cost U.S. taxpayers $2.8 trillion, and new regulations imposed by the administration in 2011 would cost over $60 billion. So during the confirmation process, when Mr. Bryson was before our committee, I asked him the question about his view on overregulation. And he stated that he would be a voice in the administration for simplifying regulation and eliminating those where the costs of regulation exceed the benefits. I believe his business background qualifies him to address that issue. It would give him the experience to be helpful in bringing back the regulations that are stifling the growth of business and therefore the job creation in our country. I also appreciated that Mr. Bryson said in the confirmation hearing that the National Labor Relations Board was wrong in trying to keep Boeing from choosing where it would manufacture its products. On the corporate tax rate, the U.S. currently has the second highest corporate tax rate in the world, behind Japan, which has said it will lower its rate, ultimately leaving the U.S. with the dubious distinction of having the highest corporate tax rate in the world. Lowering the U.S. corporate tax rate should be a substantial part of any tax reform, and although that tax policy is beyond the Commerce Secretary's responsibility, I did ask Mr. Bryson the question of whether he believed our corporate tax rate was too high and would he be a voice for lowering it, and he said he would. I thought that was a very important statement for him to make and important for the Secretary of Commerce to commit to doing. We have now passed the free trade agreements that were really the holdup on considering his nomination. If confirmed, I expect Mr. Bryson to take advantage of the agreements and work to assist our businesses with the efforts to reach out and expand new markets with these new free trade agreements. Mr. Bryson stated before the Commerce Committee that he made statements supporting cap-and-trade legislation because he felt that electric utility industry, of which he was the chairman of a major corporation in that industry, needed regulatory certainty. That was his reason for coming out for cap-and-trade. Now, I disagree with him on that, and I agree with many of my colleagues that that is not the right approach for America. We should not have cap-and-trade, and as some have called it, cap and tax. But Mr. Bryson again said that he had no interest in pursuing that kind of legislation if he is confirmed as Secretary of Commerce. I would point out that Mr. Bryson has the support of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, the Hispanic Chamber of Commerce, and the National Association of Manufacturers, and they will be major constituents that he will represent in trying to build businesses for our country. He is also supported by 6 former Secretaries of Commerce, including the secretaries that have served in the administrations of George W. Bush, George H.W. Bush, and Nixon. So I believe, in summary, I believe the President should be given deference in selecting the members of his Cabinet, unless there are serious issues against the nominee. I have voted against a few of the nominees of some of the Presidents when I have been in the Senate. But I do it rarely and very carefully because I do think that elections have consequences, and I do believe the President has the right to make his decisions. I do not believe there are issues that rise to that level in the case of John Bryson. He does have a business background. He is well regarded by the many colleagues who have called me on his behalf who have been with him in the business world. And I do not see any issue that would cause me not to vote for his nomination. I will support his nomination, and I will work alongside him to be a voice for job creation in our country, and I hope that he is confirmed. I think he will be confirmed, and I would hope that he would then work with our members of Congress who want to help him be an effective voice for business and investment in America and create the jobs that will get this unemployment rate back down and get people back to work. Thank you, Mr. President. I don't have people on my side yet who are going to speak, but there are two others who wish to speak. I will put us in a quorum call until they get to the floor, and then that will probably allow us to give back time. Now, Mr. President, I would just ask my colleagues who are listening if they wish to speak on behalf of or against Mr. Bryson to please come to the floor now so that we will be able to know that everyone has been satisfied and we will be able to take this to a vote. I do think Mr. Bryson has waited very patiently for a very long time to have this come to a conclusion, and I hope that we can do that on as quick a basis as we can, giving everyone their ability to talk if they choose to. Thank you, Mr. President, and I suggest the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
nomination and their continued great work in the Commerce Committee, a committee of which I once had the great honor of serving on until the senator from Texas forced me to leave. But, Mr. President, I rise today to support the nomination of Mr. John Bryson to be the 37th Secretary of the Department of Commerce. As I mentioned, during my time in the Senate, I had the great honor of serving on the Commerce, Science, and Transportation Committee, one of the most, in my view, one of the most important committees in the United States Senate. And it is really a wonderful and broadening experience to be a member of that committee. And I think it's important what we are discussing here today, and that is whether Mr. Bryson should be confirmed by members on my side of the aisle, because we may not agree with some of his views and some of his philosophies and some of his statements in the past. And I'd like to be clear, if I were President of the United States, I would probably not have nominated Mr. Bryson, even though I am confident that he's a fine man. We just have different views on different issues. But I think we all ought to appreciate the fact that elections do have consequences. And when a President of the United States is elected, we have an important role to play of advise and consent. But we also have a role to play in understanding that the American people have spoken and elected a President of the United States, placed on him the responsibilities of the presidency, and the best way he can carry out those responsibilities in the most efficient fashion is to have members of his team around him, people that he has trust and confidence in. Now, Mr. Bryson clearly has the trust and confidence of the President of the United States. There are times when all of us have opposed a nominee for an office that requires the advice and consent of the Senate of the United States. But those occasions should be rare. Those occasions should be when the judgment of the senator should be that that individual is not fit to serve. Now, that's a big difference between whether you think that individual should serve or not. In other words, the president's right, in my view, to have a team around him so he can best serve the country is a very important consideration without losing or in any way diminishing our responsibilities of advice and consent. Now, Mr. Bryson has held a number of positions in business and in other walks of life that are impressive. Now, he may not have made statements or done things that we particularly agree with, but I don't think you could really question Mr. Bryson's credentials and background to fulfill the job of Secretary of Commerce, and that should be the criteria in my view. And everybody's entitled to their opinions as to their role as senators in the advice and consent role, and I don't try to tell any other senator what their role is, but I think that the Senate, during most of its existence, you'd find that the President of the United States was given the benefit of appointing that individual to positions of authority and responsibility because the President earned that right. So it has to be an overriding reason to vote to reject that nominee. And by the way, I would point out in this particular case, because of inaction on the trade agreements, a group of us sent a letter to the majority leader saying we would withhold support for the current nominee until the free trade agreements were passed. The free trade agreements were passed. They were passed. And so I would urge my colleagues to look at Mr. Bryson's background, and not whether you agree with his statements or philosophy, but whether he is truly qualified, and I believe that he is qualified to serve. I would also mention, not in passing to my colleagues on this side of the aisle, that someday, sooner or later, we will have a Republican president. I hope sooner rather than later. And that president will be appointing or nominating individuals to serve on his team or her team. And then I hope that my colleagues on the other side of the aisle will also observe sort of what has been traditional here in the United States Senate, and that is that you give a President of the United States a certain latitude to pick the members of his team who he thinks will help him serve this nation through difficult times with the utmost efficiency and loyalty. So I want to thank both Senator Rockefeller and Senator Hutchinson for their work on this important and, in my view, all too controversial nomination, and I urge my colleagues to vote in support of the nomination of John Bryson to be the 37th Secretary of the Department of Commerce.